Welcome everybody. Today we're gonna talk about the current state of the electronic supply chain. Look at what we can what we believe we can expect for the remainder of 2022 and some trends we're seeing. I'm gonna give us about 1 minute because I see some people are still joining right now, and we're gonna kick this off in just under a minute. Okay, looks like we've got a number of people have come in now, so if we want to go ahead and get started, if we're going to take us to the next slide. A little background about myself. So my name is Chris Church. I'm the co-founder and chief product officer here at Macrofab. I've been in the software world, the hardware world for quite a while, both on the customer side and most recently on the manufacturing side. Here at Macrofab, what I do is I work with our product engineering and support teams. And so, both from a support perspective and product capabilities, we deal quite a bit with the current supply chain and some different, strategies for our teams to work around. And for those who are unfamiliar with who we are at Macrofab, we are a cloud manufacturing platform for electronics. We enable our customers to go from prototype to scale up volumes using a network of factories so that we can find the right fit for their jobs at the right time. And if we can go ahead and go to the next slide, talk about the agenda. So today we're going to talk about the overall outlook for 2022. We're going to look at some trends we're seeing in customer managed inventory. We're also going to talk about how lead times are shaping up for different components out there. We're going to talk about some of the things that give us hope that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel before too long. And then we're going to wrap up with some of the risks we see going into 2022 and some things that you can do either as a purchaser or designer to help manage and mitigate those. So if we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so right now, if you were to ask, the survey went out to a lot of the manufacturers and vendors in the industry late in December, and about half of them felt that the supply chains were going to get worse in the first half of the year, and the other half felt they were going to stay just as bad as they were. And that is the overall feedback I'm getting from distributors, component manufacturers, customers, and contract manufacturers across the board. We are not expecting to see an end to the supply chain shortage in the first half of 2022. If we start thinking about how we take the different input from the different vendors out there, from the component manufacturers and from the distributors, the view generally today is that we're going to start seeing some loosening up in the second half of the year. And with potentially normalization happening sometime in 2023. But like all things, it is not even across the board. We're looking at analog, wireless, microcontrollers, and anything automotive related. We're going to continue to see rising lead times on those for the first half of the year. And some of those categories may not normalize even by the beginning of 2023. One part that is, really going to continue happening here, though, we're seeing this across the board, is price increases. Part of how we're seeing some of this, the supply chain starting to normalize in a couple cases, is the prices are going up and people are a little less inclined to build up a lot of inventory at a high price right now, which is helping to make some of that available. But we're going to expect to see significant price increases throughout the year. In particular, we are seeing 2% or greater price increases across the board in general, quarter over quarter. So kind of consistently here, what we're seeing is that in the most in-demand spaces, those are going to be analog, wireless, microcontrollers, and automotive related, like I said, we're going to see more price increase there. Whereas in other areas, especially interconnect, stuff like that, we're going to see lower price increases because the inventories are increasing out there. But that being said, we can expect overall material pricing to continue to be on the rise. We've seen significant increases over the past 12 months, and we don't see a slowdown to that right now. Um, so kind of wrapping up what really 22 is going to look like to us, right? We're going to expect the first half of the year is going to be as bad or potentially worse than what we saw in 2021. We're going to see prices increase, and then we're going to see that market start to stabilize and normalize in certain categories in the second half of the year, with other categories really starting to take well into 2023 to start to turn around. So if we could go to the next slide. Now, an interesting trend that we've seen is what we call self-managed or customer-managed inventory. So when we think about from a contract manufacturer's perspective, the materials can either be turnkey, consigned, or in some way pulled from customer-managed inventory. If we look at the graph here, we're looking at of the orders that Macrofab that we see, and we work for thousands of customers every year, and again, about 75 factories. So we get a lot of visibility into what's going on out there. We're seeing a steady increase in customer managed inventory. That's a blend of either warehoused inventory, or, stored with the contract manufacturer but owned by the customer, or consignment at order time. We'll notice that, at the beginning of the pandemic in early 2020, about 20% of orders would have one or more line items be customer managed. We've seen spiking up into January and late in Q4 as well, as high as 60% of orders. So that significant change talks to one of the things we've seen a lot from customers in this space is that when they can find materials, they are acquiring them on their own well before they're ready to start producing, so they can make sure that they actually have those materials. And when we put all that together, what that means is we're seeing across the board, whether it's at the contract manufacturer level or at the OEM level, we're seeing, even though they're shipping less product than before, inventory levels on what we would call the customer end versus the supplier end are increasing rapidly. I myself have, had a chance to look at some of the inventory we're dealing with for customers, and we're finding that they were able to acquire 50 to 75% of the components they needed over the past year, but they're sitting on that inventory. And we're going to talk a little bit later about what that means as we start to come out of this supply chain crunch and some of the risks we're going to see there. But the key thing to think of here is that from a OEM perspective and from a contract manufacturer perspective, we are seeing a significant move to pre-buying inventory when it's available, which is helping to increase the unavailability of some of these components, because these are not products that are just going right out in the field and being built. They're getting some percentage of that inventory and having to sit on it for a while. And if we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. What that means is, kind of thinking about the lead times, we will see through 2020, there wasn't a lot of activity going on, right? People were still concerned about the pandemic, and then production starts to increase in 2021 as people start to, realize that the economy is really roaring strong and we need to buy a lot of, product and get it out there. But the real interesting thing here is on the semiconductors. We saw a huge spike in lead times in the the third quarter going into the fourth quarter. And a big part of that was the customers coming in and putting in a lot of advanced orders. So we're talking to some companies that have, they're out there buying materials for 2 to 3 years worth of production and putting those orders on the books, which are really pushing out the lead times on everyone right now. Because when those orders come in, they get it in ahead of you, and those have to be satisfied. And if they take 2 years to build, all the orders in front of you, you're looking at a significant, lead time there. The passives are also increasing, not at the same rate that semiconductors have. So these are your capacitors, your resistors, your diodes, et cetera. We're seeing similar, increases in lead times there, but not like we're seeing in the semiconductors, because this really, a lot of what is triggering this is a lack of capacity at the semiconductor fabs, and all the other categories for the most part are being driven by people, or by companies really trying to lock up inventory. So we're going to continue to see growth in the lead times, as I mentioned previously, over the first half of the year before we start to see those start to come back down. Now, one of the things we are hearing quite a bit, and we are seeing that in the data, is the actual manufacturing orders are decreasing quarter over quarter. We typically will see in Q4, a decrease in manufacturing orders. That's for OEMs going to contract manufacturers. And we did see that in Q4. It was a pretty significant decrease. And we're also looking at continued decrease in new orders coming in. So what that's telling us again is that the demand we're seeing now is driven as much by future need for the materials as for current needs. And so that is one thing that we really want to pay attention to and look at where that's happening and form the right strategies around that. So looking at our semiconductors, of course, if those are the blockers for our production, we do want to try to get some orders in for those. We do want to look at alternative sourcing strategies for those, perhaps. With our interconnects and electromechanicals, it doesn't make a lot of sense to build up any inventory. The lead times are not particularly increasing. They're well behind the other categories there. So we have to think as purchasing managers, as anyone who's really strongly interested in our inventory. We want to make sure that we're applying the right strategies to the right materials and not just trying to buy everything we can whenever it's available, because not only does that distort the market a little bit and create the risk of a bullwhip effect, which we will talk later about the bullwhip effects. It increases that risk, but it also can reduce the trust in the component manufacturers in the need to bring up the additional capacity. One of the things that, we saw this previously in the, much smaller in scope, passive crunch of 2018 is when a lot of demand starts coming in, the first instinct of any manufacturer is to start making more, right? Because I have a lot of demand. But the manufacturer has to have trust that that demand is real. And one thing in particular, we are seeing a significant number of canceled orders. So if we can go ahead and go to the next slide. We're seeing at the component manufacturers a significant number of canceled orders. So these are future orders in backlog where people are saying, hey, I want to put in an order for, 200,000 units of this particular component to be delivered in summer of 2021. We saw in Q4 a 30% increase in backlog order cancellations at component manufacturers. And that speaks to the trust that the component manufacturers have that this demand is real, that we're really going to, see a lot of that it's worth bringing up this new capacity. I think on the semiconductor side, everyone, feels very confident there, and that's what I'm hearing. The problem with semiconductor capacity is it takes a couple years to deploy. You can't flip it, build a new high-tech factory for semiconductor production and just turn it on in a few months. We see a lot of backlogs in the equipment used to produce that. In some cases, for like the EUV equipment, we are seeing probably 2-year lead times on some of the critical components there. So that we look at the semiconductor areas, the ICs, the advanced ICs, especially anything that's using EUV, so your 7 nanometer and smaller, we're going to see continued lack of capacity in meeting that demand for at least another year or so. And that speaks to what we talked about earlier, that looking at the microcontrollers and the processors, seeing that, stretch in our wireless and analog really stretching into 2023 as some of that demand works out. But on the other side of the market, we're starting to see inventory levels normalize. So looking at this graph here, which comes from TPC, this is from their most recent January survey. We'll see the line of 3 is considered nominal, sort of the desired level of inventory for any component, whereas numbers above 3 are excess amounts of inventory, and below 3 are less inventory than they would prefer to have. What we'll see here is the DRAM, NAND flash, and capacitors. The inventory level's been going up, and it's staying up, and we're now approaching or exceeding nominal inventory levels for those. However, for microcontrollers, analog, and wireless, after a significant period of increasing inventories, we're now seeing that inventory drop again. That means that, a lot of the other blocking components were out of the way for those bills of materials for products which use those, and customers are now starting to take delivery of that inventory there. So the key takeaway, from that concept is we want to keep an eye out on the backlog order cancellations. The more those start to increase, the less likely those vendors are, to start deploying new capacity. But it's another indicator that for that particular category of components, we run the risk of having a bullwhip effect. That is where we go from having not enough supply to being oversupplied in the market, and we start seeing prices decrease on that, which again puts more pressure on the supply chain channel there to take some actions. As we mentioned, we're seeing a reduction in bookings. So 47% of manufacturers and suppliers saw a reduction in Q4 over Q3 orders, and they're also expecting the same level of reduction in new bookings and orders here in Q1. So again, that's one of the main indicators we're using as we start to think about what the next half of the year looks like. And again, we want to pay close attention, right? Some components, we see it's normalized. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves there, right? If capacitors, we don't need to worry too much about the lead times on those today, unless of course they're in automotive rated. There we have a lot of competition for that material. But when it comes to microcontrollers, your analog, your wireless elements, those things are where we really have to worry about the lead times on those increasing, and making sure we're setting up the right relationships with the vendors and manufacturers of those components to ensure that we have the inventory we need to build through the first half of 22 and potentially even into 2023. We do want to be cautious though about going beyond that point. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so when we think about the risks here, what we have are, we kind of think about the bullwhip effect. That is where we go from not enough capacity, not enough supply out there. Everybody buys up everything they can. Manufacturers make more of the components, vendors stock more of the components, and as they get ready to start shipping those orders out, those orders get canceled. We did see, and this was a huge issue during the passive crunch, that really depressed prices and actually impacted a lot of companies that were intermediaries in the supply chain, where customers were going out and putting orders for the same parts with every vendor they could. And then what would happen is, if you only need 10,000 of that component and you place orders with 3 vendors for 10,000 each, well, what's going to happen is you're going to cancel 2 of those orders. And so what ends up happening there is, that price for that material starts to plummet very rapidly because the demand is much lower than people thought. And with a lot of excess inventory, people start to get really concerned about their ability to hold that at the distribution level, for example. We know that the vendors have gotten smarter about detecting that. It was a major issue during the supply chain, the passive crunch, and everyone was still feeling the pain from that going into this. So what we have been seeing is a lot of the distributors are actually double checking with the manufacturers to make sure they're not holding duplicate orders. We see that um, a lot of the distribution channels and the manufacturers are treating those duplicate orders as sort of ghost demand, and they're not really, trusting that it's there. But the reality is, a lot of companies are still buying more inventory than they're going to need in the short term, just to ensure that they have something. And so what we're already starting to hear is that from some of the consumers, they're already over capacity in their inventory for some components, and they're not, I would say, they're not comfortable just going and taking them back out and direct to market because they're worried about depressing the price and, having to sell it for less than they bought it for. So we know that, based on the sort of the back channel communication we're hearing out there, that in certain types of components, we're going to start seeing more inventory freeing up, but they generally are trying to free it up in small increments so that we don't create that bullwhip pricing effect in the market. So expect more of that to start happening in the first half of 2021, especially in those areas where there aren't fab level restraints on the capacity. Again, a lot of passives, interconnects. We're going to start seeing those, actually potentially seeing some price decreases, but definitely seeing some lead time decreases and more material availability in smaller chunks at brokers and other alternative sources. And from that perspective, we have heard from a lot of customers that there are some manufacturers that are saying, "Hey, I'm happy to take this order for materials and guarantee the lead time, but I need this to be NCNR, that is non-cancelable, non-returnable." And in some cases, we've seen, requests for multi-year demand under NCNR contracts. I want to say be cautious about that. Understand the risks you're going into there. If the availability for that component increases during the term of your contract, the price is unlikely to change. So where you can get stuck here is that you are buying, future inventory at today's prices when prices have gone back down, and we've seen that already with a number of contracts that we've had with customers where we have to go back and renegotiate them because the availability of that material substantially increased and the current market price is lower than the contracted price on that. So be very cautious about that because the more of this that goes on, the harder it is for that inventory to come back into the market. Because again, no one wants to sell it at a loss, and no one wants to be the last person sitting on a big pile of overpriced inventory. The core economics of manufacturing remain the same. We can only raise prices so much and still keep the same customer demand. So a lot of times it can take years to work out that excess cost of goods out of the product line. So one of the things, we always talk about the adage about the stock market, right? Is the market can remain insane longer than you can remain solvent. We do understand, and I think everyone understands, that future price reductions and excess supply are not going to help with today's production, right? We still need to take advantage of certain tactics and tools in our belt to keep that production flowing, keep our products getting out there to market. And in particular, we do see redesigns and alternate suppliers still a primary activity that we can do to address this today. We can go out there where possible. It does take time, it does have cost, but if there are alternative components that might need a tweak to your design and they have better availability, now's a good time to continue to keep doing that if you haven't been doing that already. Alternatively is, there are still brokers, there are, several different sources you can go to help find challenging materials. And of course, you want to make sure you are working with trustworthy ones, ones that you know well, ones that have been around. I think I just saw the financials, I think from Smith and Associates just came out. something like a 50% increase in revenue in 2021 from customers coming and looking for new ways to acquire the materials they need versus the sort of traditional channels there. Basically, the wrap up on the risks we want to look at here is don't get overextended. Don't go, beyond a couple years horizon on your contracts if you can do that. Be prepared for prices to go down on materials when that material starts to have greater availability, and think about maybe blending your inventory if you can do that from your finances to keep that cost down as that material comes out. Don't overcommit, and don't put fake orders out there, right? Don't duplicate your orders across multiple channels because people are paying attention to that. The manufacturers, are working with the distributors to make sure that they're getting real demand, and it won't necessarily help you at all in that case. It's very unlikely that that will result in the outcomes you're looking for. Do, where possible, go out there and think about any changes you can make to your design. One thing we see some companies doing are to degrade functionality to keep product flowing. Where possible, that's something you can definitely approach. And actually, we will have a future webinar, I think in about a month, where we're going to talk about some of the different strategies you can deploy in your product design to help reduce issues around market availability of components. So with that, that is our high-level overview of the state of the market today. We generally produce about once a quarter. We produce a little more in-depth blog post on this, and we should have a new one coming out soon. Keep an eye out for that. It'll have more statistics in it as we get the final data in from Q4 from IPC and ECIA and all the different vendors out there. But now we have some time for some questions. So if we can go ahead and move to any questions there, I'm happy to answer those.
I'm monitoring the panel, Chris, so let me see if there are more questions. There's a questions panel, guys, in the GoToWebinar panel. If you have any questions, feel free to ask a question over there.
Yeah, I know one of the questions is, will the presentation be shared? Absolutely, we will send out the webinar recording. If you want the raw slide deck, maybe you want to show it to your team, feel free to email me at church@macrofab.com, and I'm happy to send that out to you as well.
There's a question that just came in, Chris. I'm not sure if you can see it. There are a couple actually coming in.
I can't, so if you can just read them to me.
Okay, yeah. So the first one is, once all these domestic foundries come online, will they drop prices for these components?
Interesting. So domestic foundries, if we're thinking about the projects by Intel, TSMC, et cetera, in Arizona, up in the Northeast, they're actually, many of those are probably about 2 years away from any level of production. And they're typically going to be focused on some of the highest value components. One of the things we see is around the defense industry, right? A lot of these fabs are really being built to support the aerospace and the defense industry because, when we're thinking about why the government, gives grants and really puts pressure on the fabs to move some production to the US, it's easy for us to think about, well, it's to help reduce consumer demand, et cetera, free that up. But the reality is the first priority is going to be critical and security sensitive industries. So that's where we're seeing a lot of this new capability being deployed towards. And it's going to be about a 2-year lead time really to get it fully up and running at production. They may start producing their first chips in 6 months or a year, but it's going to take some time to really get that worked out. So I don't think that we're going to see any downwards pricing pressure on most of the semiconductors we will purchase in the next couple of years from the domestic US fabs or from the domestic EU fabs. They're similarly structured. The bulk of our consumer goods, the bulk of our industrial components will still be coming from existing fabs overseas. And the pricing pressure is really going to be highest on the highest technology. That is to say, we're seeing less and less deployment and support for older processes that your 23 nanometer, your 28 nanometer and up, and a lot more investment in the EUV, the 7 nanometer, the real high tech stuff. So a lot of that's being deployed around communications. We're talking cell phones, laptops, computing, high-end, high technology, and that's where a lot of that's going because that's where most of the value is for those fabs today. Producing, the same chip design that's been produced for 20 years. It's very reliable, but it's a very low profit. There's a lot of pricing pressure on that already. So we will continue to see, even as these new fabs come up and become productive, the pricing pressure still increase on that older technology as more sensitive, safety sensitive companies like automotive manufacturers, industrial, device manufacturers, take time to shift off of that older technology and certify new technology. So we're going to continue to see pricing pressure there for several years at least.
Thanks, Chris. We have quite a few questions, couple of hand raises. So I'll go next to a hand raise. Dave, I don't know if you still have the question you want to ask. Dave F. Felicia, if I'm not butchering your name, I can unmute you for a minute or so. Or you can ask the question in the question panel. All right, I'll move to the next question. Dave, feel free to ask your question in the question panel. The next question, Chris, is how much extra inventory do you recommend purchasing?
As little as you can get away with. Really, excess inventory purchasing it's a challenge to think about, right? On the one hand, where we don't want to be is, in a position that we're being held up by something we need, and that one part is the one thing that's causing us to not be able to produce our products, right? No one wants to be in that position. It's the risk of just-in-time manufacturing that has been exposed, with the current supply chain challenges. However, building up too much excess inventory is going to reduce your ability to react to when necessary inventory becomes available. And what I mean there is locking up a lot of your capital and inventory that you don't need right now is a real risk. So what I would say is generally take a balanced strategy. Look at the lead time trends. You can go to IHS Market. You can pay to get access to that data, and they have excellent data looking at how the lead times are changing. They have excellent data around price projections for different categories of components. You can utilize that data to create a strategy where you create excess inventory for your highest risk materials or those things most likely to see a significant price increase or lead time increase, while continuing to be a little more just in time for your low risk materials. And then really that's, every company is going to have their own strategy and their own, willingness to hold excess inventory. But I definitely caution against just going out and getting, blanket, building up inventory, because as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing a lot of companies who deployed that earlier on in the pandemic strategy now trying to find ways to move that excess inventory off their books without impacting the value of that inventory.
Chris, there is a very close question to what you already answered. The question, is there any software to calculate the optimal quantity of inventory?
That's a good question. I think if there were a highly effective piece of software in every case, they'd be making money hand over fist right now. The reality is most of that still boils down to Excel for most companies, because again, the inputs, um, they're going to be, fairly unique. I know a lot of ERP systems claim that capability. I've also talked to a lot of different people at different manufacturers who barely even use their ERP systems in today's markets, simply because it's not flexible enough to account for the daily changes in the material availability. Um, so, now you think about it, I'd like to write some of that software myself. Maybe I should have started about 6 months ago. But no, I mean, at the end of the day today, I think the right way to calculate inventory is going to change on or calculate how much inventory you should have on hand is going to change quite a bit on a company by company basis. And you're probably as well served by, creating your own spreadsheet to calculate that out as by buying something off the shelf. But I am 100% certain that about 2 days after me saying this on this webinar, someone is going to come back and tell me about some great software system that really, is changing the world on that right now. And I really look forward to hearing about that because I'd like to use it too.
Perfect. The next one is really close to home. Have you seen any changes in PCB lead times and material availability, or has
Oh.
that remained, or has that remained more constant when compared to ICs and other components?
Yeah, so the PCB market, and I actually, I feel a little remiss because I should have talked about that here in this discussion as well. But we talk so much about components that it sometimes gets a short shrift. So what we, for those who are unfamiliar, we have seen material availability and lead times for PCB fabrication go up significantly across, during the pandemic. There were a handful, outside of obviously moving materials around, there were two really strong drivers in this. One was that there were significant outages at two different resin plants that create the resin for a lot of the fiberglass that's being used in the PCB materials. And the other is the drive towards electric automobiles. It was shifting copper from cladding to the PCBs over to making battery interconnects for electric automobiles. Why? Because it was easier and faster to make that than the very high performance cladding we need for PCBs. So it was a faster way to profit, and the market conditions pushed it that way. We see continuing challenges around thicker, copper cladding. So your 2 ounces and up are still seeing lead time impacts there. Um, the resin issue is largely getting worked out at this point. We're seeing more stabilization in like the FR4 material for standard FR4s. Once you start getting into special purpose substrates, that's where we are seeing a very significant increase in lead times, and we expect those to remain high. Right now, obviously, we are in the middle of Lunar New Year. It won't be ending until this weekend, and we'll see some backlog demand from the PCB fabricators there, because again, a lot of them are produced in Asia, especially in the China region. So we're gonna kind of keep our ear to the ground there over the next 2 weeks to see how the factory startups go after the Lunar New Year holiday. And one of the concerns to us, of course, it is in the pandemic times we are in, is any concern where there might be an outbreak in a major manufacturing region with a zero COVID policy in China that would cause a slower return to factory, like we saw last year, where you expect lead times to start to normalize within a week of the Lunar New Year festival, but then we start seeing they're still extending and going on for a good month and a half after the Lunar New Year festival. So that's what we're going to keep our eye on right now. But I would say for your thicker copper clads, your special substrates, we're going to continue to see extended lead times for a while. But the more simple, the thinner copper cladding and the more standard substrates should continue to stabilize once we come back from Lunar New Year, barring any regional shutdowns. Do we have any
More
more?
questions. Oh yeah, quite a
Okay,
few,
good.
Chris. Yeah,
Excellent.
and all of these are good. I'm just reading through them and I'm trying to combine a couple of questions.
Mhm.
They're very close. So the next one is the only way to relieve this bottleneck to build more capacity to your previous comment, right? We are seeing more and more plants coming up, but they are not gonna really be so-called live, right, for at least the next 12, 18 months where we can see more production come out of those plants. Were we previously just in time and the pandemic surfaced this? So I think this is more to your previous comments around capacity.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing. So there's a lot of commentary out there. If you look at what people are talking about, how this was all caused by just in time. Well, it wasn't actually caused by just in time. What we see is that supply chain disruptions disrupt poor just-in-time strategies, right? If you're trying to keep zero inventory levels, really just building on demand, that works for some products, and that works as long as the supply chain works. The interesting thing to look in this, what happened in 2021 is Toyota was basically the company that really got everybody moving towards just-in-time production. And they were one of the last automakers to be impacted by the supply chain issue. And that was because they didn't take that just in time as the only possible outcome strategy. It really goes back to risk mitigation. So we need to make sure that we're accurately identifying the risks in our supply chain and not just saying how much inventory should I hold, but should I be dual sourcing? Should I be considering my design in such a way that I eliminate the single points of failure? Because a lot of times we tend to think we're dual sourcing. We say, hey, um, I'm buying this component from two different distributors, right? But that component is being made in the same fab. So we're really, we're doing some price hedging, but we're not actually dual sourcing there. And in other cases, you can actually have alternate components that look like they're made by different companies, but they're made on the exact same line, they're packaged by the same facility, and they're just marked with a different marking for a different company. So one of the things that it really behooves us, what the supply chain disruptions during the pandemic have or should be teaching us, is to really think about true supply chain diversity. Can I buy my PCBs both from a Chinese vendor and maybe from a European vendor? Can I get alternative components that are made at different fabs by different manufacturers? Looking into things like that can really help us with that. Now, obviously, if you can't get it shipped to you, if you can't get it to you in real time, that's another thing. But we can plan those risks, right? We can do sensitivity analysis in our inventory modeling and our risk modeling and ask the question, well, what happens to my production or my producibility of my product if my ship time for these core materials increases by 20% or by 50% or 100%? We can do that sensitivity analysis in our modeling, and it can show us our worst case scenarios and highlight for us where we need to put the most of our attention. So that's really how I tend to look at our strategies around just in time. Now, the other part of the question there is, will excess capacity be the thing, or additional capacity be the thing that gets us out of this? Not entirely. We could, like I say, more capacity is going to come online, but we're also seeing companies buy more than they need. And we see a lot of companies, not all of them, but there are certainly companies out there that are just blanket buying everything they can get their hands on, and looking at, their production for, 2023, and they're stocking up for that now. Um, that's sort of the opposite of a just-in-time approach, right? It's reacting exactly opposite of what you were doing before. So I think a big part of this is going to be the normalizing of demand to be a little short-term time window. I don't know, and again, this is where you'll find differing opinions. I don't know that the actual demand for materials is directly in line with the consumer demand for those products. In certain categories, they certainly are, right? If we think about automotive, the demand is definitely there, especially with electric automobiles. But in other categories, the the component demand is higher than the market demand for those products seems to be. So we're going to need to see some adjustment to the purchasing strategies in those markets long before we'll actually be able to see the input of new capacity at the manufacturers. Because again, a lot of the stuff we're seeing challenges around lead times on are not the sort of things that we can quickly spin up new capacity for.
Chris, there are three questions that I'm gonna kind of combine in one.
Okay.
They're really great. So the questions are more around: is there another way to look at, any resources to vet or research non-authorized distributors?
Mhm.
Uh, there was a similar question. Any thoughts about buying from non-stream suppliers for hard to obtain components? So basically, the question is, you have these mainstream suppliers.
Mhm.
Are there resources that people can start looking at? If it's not available with mainstream, what are other options we have?
Yeah, yeah. So I think one of the things that is an excellent question, and it's actually one, we discuss internally a lot as well. It's important, I think, to define for those who are unfamiliar what the terminology means. We tend to talk about authorized distributors and non-authorized, or we might say independent distributors or non-stocking distributors. So an authorized distributor is someone who has an agreement with that component manufacturer to carry and warehouse that component to some degree, right? And they'll be listed, if you call that manufacturer and say, where should I buy this component from? They'll go down that list of authorized distributors. Now, separate from those, we have what we call our independent distributors. And these are, distributors who don't have a stocking agreement with those manufacturers. And they can be kind of broken up into two categories, right? We have very large, in some cases, as large, nearly as large as the authorized distributors, independent distributors. And they can be very, very, very trustworthy, right? They will have testing services in-house. They will have a lot of different ways to validate the inventory that they're buying. And then the risk we run is, in these uncertain times, we get a lot of kind of fly-by-night. I hate to use the term broker because the broker is a common term for an independent distributor, but we can get some really small brokers pop up, and that's where you start running into the risk. I think as long as you're working with a well-known independent distributor with a significant line of business that has an in-house testing and fraud detection service where they can actually validate that these are the correct components, I think that's a safe strategy and actually one that I would highly recommend because they're able to talk to these companies like the ones I mentioned earlier that have that excess inventory more than they need and they're trying to find a way to get rid of it. They can help you tap into that. Now, when you deal with the much smaller ones, the ones that just kind of pop up out of nowhere, they don't have those testing services in-house. I would be cautious of that. We've actually seen what'll happen is there are some of these small companies that pay attention to the demand coming through, other distributors, and we'll suddenly find something that's highly in demand that no one else can find, and no, I just happened to find it. We've in more than one case. when, in the past and dealing with some of the smaller guys like that, found not valid inventory, if you would. So again, if you combine it with a testing service, you work with a well-known independent distributor, I think they are a valid source, and they should be part of your strategy. Um, and I would probably start building a relationship with them sooner than later because everyone else is talking to them. Just like I said, Innet Smith and Associates are here in Houston with us. They're very large. I think they're $3.6 billion a year independent distributor as of 2021, and their customer growth is through the roof based on their public statements. So the sooner you can form those relationships, the sooner you can put yourself in line for those things.
Great, Chris. That was one of the questions. Can you give examples of larger independent suppliers?
Yeah, well, Innet Smith is one, I know pretty well because they're based here in Houston with us. They're very trustworthy. Obviously, I don't want to speak to any specific component. I can't say whether or not they can solve the problem for you, but they are pretty well known. You also have other services. Suddenly, I'm blanking on it, but I know these guys pretty well. Suddenly, I can't remember the name, but there's one based out of California that has a European and Asian presence. And sorry, I will remember the name in a minute.
Yeah, I can send it offline,
Okay.
Chris, after the webinar. There is another really good question. How do you see the supply chain in Mexico for Macrofab in 22?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, it's the same. You know, we do, for those who don't know, we do have a facility in Mexico as well because we work with a number of Mexico-based contract manufacturers. So we have a facility in Guadalajara, which is kind of in the epicenter of automotive manufacturing. Availability. Is very similar to availability here in the US. We get a little bit less pricing pressure because I think, there's a lot more volume production happening, for example, in Guadalajara, Aguas Calientes, et cetera, than there is, say, in Texas. But generally, if it's not available in the US, it's not available in Mexico either. The only difference we'll typically see is if it's available in Mexico, we might typically see occasionally a better pricing on that material.
Pretty cool. There is another question. With microprocessor chips in high demand and price increasing, does it make sense to invest in complex design and development to redesign to alternative solutions? Or could the cost reduction window be missed due to the long engineering lead time?
That's a good question. It depends on what your engineering lead time is and how in-depth that redesign needs to be and where it puts you in a future position. So what I mean here is if I can have two variants of my product, one that I produce when a certain cheaper component is less available, and one that I produce when a more expensive component is available, but it typically has better availability. I have more options to deal with future challenges. So it is often a good thing to do from a product perspective. Especially if you're in like the industrial controls, communication spaces, et cetera, and by communication, I mean communication infrastructure, less cell phones. If you're in a market that has a longer life on the products, then it can be something worth doing, even if, by the time you're done with it, that cost saving or that material availability starts to normalize. You're going to be able to recoup those costs back on that design over time, and especially in having that flexibility. If you're in a consumer space, you know, we tend to think the lifetime for those products is shorter, but if you can't get the materials right, you can't you can't take advantage of that either. So I typically, unless the costs are just exorbitant, I would redesign around long lead time or unavailability. And by long lead time, I'm talking about 56 weeks, 2 years, 3-year lead times I'm seeing on some components out there. You can't go 3 years without producing your product. And then always having the hope that you can find it through an independent or alternative channel is not the most viable plan. In that case, you kind of really should start as soon as you see those lead times creeping up past a year. You should start the redesign then. But for things where we're mostly concerned around price, and if you've got a long engineering time, but the availability is there, I don't know that I would take that redesign action on price alone.
Pretty cool. I think we are closing to the end. One last question, Chris. It might look like a Macrofab plug, but why not? How is Macrofab's digital platform helping network partners to address their supply chain concerns?
Well, we work, one of the ways we work with our factory partners is we actually do all the material sourcing for them for the orders that we send to them. So we are able, through using our technology and thinking about how we surface supply chain information, we typically surface that at the design stage. So as we recently announced, we have a partnership with Altium, where in Altium Designer you can get real-time pricing and supply chain information while you design, and even order a copy of that. Well, that part of what we're doing there with the engineer is helping to give them input and visibility into the producibility of their product, what drives the cost, what drives the lead time. That carries us forward into the production of that product, helping us to ensure that we can get the materials. And for those cases where we don't, where there is an outage or a shortage that we have to deal with, at order time, we actually have an in-house special sourcing team who come from the independent distributors, right, and have all the relationships, and we're able to actually, we've in a number of cases over the past 6 months solved what seemed like unsolvable supply chain problems for both our customers and for our factories. So we take a multi-pronged approach, right? One is the technology, getting that real-time integration into the supply chain data. 2 is surfacing that to the product designer as early as possible. And then finally, 3 is, having an in-house special sourcing team that can go out there and unblock issues in the supply chain.
That's it. Chris, thanks for answering all the questions. Great questions, guys. Continue to keep coming to our webinars. They are, as you can see, they are mostly informational. It's an attempt to build a community. We know there are these issues that everyone is trying to solve, and during these webinars, we bring in the experts from the industry. So you will more than likely get most of your questions answered in this webinar. So the cadence for these webinars is bi-weekly. So the next one is on the 17th. The one after that is on March 3rd. Every now and then we get experts from other companies as well. You will see appearance from people from Xometry, from Altium. These are domain experts, and really good to hear from them where the industry is headed, what problems are we seeing, and how are we recommending people resolve these issues. So for future webinars, go to macrofab.com/webinars. Once this webinar is concluded, this will be available on demand as well. So feel free to share it with your coworkers. I'm pretty sure they're trying to answer and solve similar problems to you, so they will find this valuable as well. This is our first webinar of the year. Appreciate everyone's time. In return for your time, I'll be handing out Starbucks gift cards today, and you should receive that email in next couple of days. So appreciate your time, and talk to you 2 weeks from now. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining us today.